In the dimly lit chambers of the palazzo, where shadows danced against ancient stone walls and the weight of centuries pressed upon every decision, a profound understanding of human nature was being forged. The year was 1513, and stripped of his political position and exiled from the corridors of power he had once navigated with such skill, found himself confronting a truth that would echo through the ages. The most dangerous enemies of wisdom and effective governance are not the obvious threats that announce themselves with fanfare, but the silent, insidious beliefs that burrow deep into the human psyche and remain unexamined, unchallenged, and therefore utterly destructive. As he sat in his study, surrounded by the works of Livy, Cicero, and other great minds of antiquity, understood that the fall of republics, the collapse of kingdoms, and the downfall of princes rarely came from external forces alone. Instead, they emerged from within, from the comfortable assumptions that leaders and citizens alike held so dear that they never thought to question them. These beliefs, like parasites in the body politic, fed on the very foundations of power and wisdom, weakening structures that appeared strong from the outside while rotting them from within. The correspondence he maintained during his exile revealed his growing preoccupation with this phenomenon. In letter after letter to his friend, he explored the ways in which unquestioned beliefs had shaped the political landscape of Italy, contributing to the chaos and instability that plagued the peninsula. He witnessed firsthand how the Medici, despite their return to power in Florence, continued to operate under assumptions about loyalty, legitimacy, and governance that had been rendered obsolete by the changing nature of political reality. Their belief in the divine right of rule, in the permanence of alliances, and in the predictability of human nature led them to make decisions that appeared rational on the surface, but were fundamentally flawed in their foundation. This observation extended far beyond the immediate political circumstances of Renaissance Italy. Recognized that throughout history, the most catastrophic failures of leadership and judgment had their roots in beliefs so deeply embedded in the cultural and intellectual fabric of society that they became invisible to those who held them. The Roman Republic, which he studied with such devotion, had fallen not merely because of military defeats or economic pressures, but because its leaders had clung to constitutional and political assumptions that no longer corresponded to the realities of governing a vast empire. Their unquestioned faith in traditional institutions, in the balance of power between patricians and plebeians, and in the effectiveness of republican virtues in an age of professional armies and distant provinces, had blinded them to the necessity of adaptation and reform. The danger of unquestioned beliefs manifested itself most clearly in what observed to be the human tendency toward intellectual comfort. People, he noted, naturally gravitated toward explanations and worldviews that confirmed their existing preferences and validated their past decisions. This tendency was particularly pronounced among those in positions of authority, who had the most to lose from acknowledging that their fundamental assumptions might be wrong. A prince who had built his legitimacy on claims of divine appointment was unlikely to entertain seriously the possibility that political authority derived from more mundane sources. A republic that had prospered under a particular set of institutions was resistant to recognizing when those institutions had become obstacles to continued success. This intellectual inertia created a peculiar form of blindness that termed the tyranny of custom. Unlike physical blindness, which announced itself immediately and forced adaptation, this form of blindness was invisible to those who suffered from it. They continued to see the world, but they saw it through the lens of their unexamined assumptions, missing crucial details and misinterpreting vital signs. The result was a systematic distortion of reality that led to increasingly poor decisions as circumstances changed and old assumptions became less and less applicable to new situations. The process by which unquestioned beliefs took hold and maintained their power revealed itself to be both subtle and devastating. It began with success. A particular approach to governance, warfare, or diplomacy would prove effective under specific circumstances, leading to positive outcomes that reinforced confidence in the underlying assumptions. Over time, these assumptions would harden into doctrine, becoming not merely preferred methods, but articles of faith that defined the identity and self-understanding of those who held them. The original circumstances that had made these approaches successful would gradually change, but the beliefs themselves would persist, protected by the psychological and social investment that individuals and institutions had made in them. Observed this pattern repeatedly in his analysis of contemporary events. The French monarchy's unwavering commitment to feudal concepts of honor and chivalric warfare had served them well in earlier centuries, but had become a liability in an age of gunpowder, mercenary armies, and rapidly shifting alliances. Their belief in the superiority of heavy cavalry and the decisiveness of individual valor led them to underestimate the effectiveness of new military technologies and tactics, resulting in costly defeats that could have been avoided through a more flexible and pragmatic approach to warfare. Similarly, the Papal State's adherence to temporal claims rooted in medieval concepts of ecclesiastical authority had once provided them with significant political leverage, but had become a source of weakness in a period when secular rulers were asserting their independence and religious authority was being challenged by reformed theological movements. The Pope's insistence on maintaining traditional prerogatives often put him at odds with the very princes whose support was essential for the Church's temporal security, creating unnecessary conflicts that weakened both ecclesiastical and political authority. The most insidious aspect of this phenomenon was its self-reinforcing nature. As unquestioned beliefs led to poor decisions and negative outcomes, the natural human response was not to examine the beliefs themselves, but to assume that they had been imperfectly applied or that external circumstances had prevented their proper implementation. This led to a doubling down on failed approaches, an intensification of commitment to problematic assumptions, and an increasing resistance to alternative perspectives that might offer more effective solutions. Witness this dynamic in the repeated attempts by Italian city-states to restore their independence through traditional diplomatic and military methods that had proven inadequate to the challenges posed by the new European monarchies. Rather than recognizing that the fundamental nature of interstate relations had changed, requiring new approaches to alliance building, resource mobilization, and strategic thinking, these states continued to rely on outdated concepts of balance of power and personal loyalty that left them vulnerable to more systematic and ruthless competitors. The psychological mechanisms underlying the persistence of unquestioned beliefs revealed themselves to be deeply rooted in human nature itself. People needed stability and predictability in their understanding of the world, and admitting that fundamental assumptions might be wrong introduced an element of uncertainty that many found intolerable. This was particularly true for those in leadership positions, whose authority often depended on projecting confidence and clarity of vision. A prince who acknowledged that his basic understanding of governance might be flawed would inevitably face challenges to his legitimacy from rivals who claimed to possess greater wisdom and certainty. The social and institutional structures that surrounded political authority further reinforced this tendency toward intellectual rigidity. Courtiers, advisors, and bureaucrats had strong incentives to confirm the preconceptions of their superiors rather than challenge them with uncomfortable truths. Those who questioned fundamental assumptions were likely to be seen as disloyal or dangerous, while those who provided reassuring confirmation of existing beliefs were rewarded with favor and advancement. This created an echo chamber effect that insulated leaders from corrective feedback and allowed dangerous misconceptions to persist and compound over time. This analysis revealed that the most effective leaders throughout history had been those who somehow managed to escape or transcend this trap of unquestioned beliefs. These individuals possessed what he came to think of as intellectual courage, the willingness to subject their own assumptions to rigorous scrutiny, and to abandon cherished beliefs when evidence contradicted them. This quality was exceedingly rare because it required not only intellectual honesty, but also a form of psychological resilience that allowed individuals to function effectively despite uncertainty and ambiguity. Caesar, whom studied extensively, had demonstrated this quality in his willingness to abandon traditional Roman military and political practices when they proved inadequate to the challenges he faced. Rather than clinging to established precedents, he adapted his strategies to fit the specific circumstances he encountered, showing a flexibility of mind that allowed him to succeed where more conventional leaders had failed. His crossing of the Rubicon represented not merely a military decision, but a fundamental rejection of constitutional assumptions that had governed Roman political life for centuries. Similarly, the great princes and republics that had achieved lasting success had typically been those that institutionalized mechanisms for questioning and revising their basic operating assumptions. The Venetian Republic, which regarded as one of the most successful political entities of his time, had developed elaborate systems for gathering information, debating policy alternatives, and adapting to changing circumstances. Their success stemmed not from the superiority of any particular set of beliefs, but from their systematic commitment to treating all beliefs as provisional and subject to revision based on experience and evidence. The challenge of identifying and overcoming unquestioned beliefs was complicated by their tendency to masquerade as common sense or natural law. The most dangerous assumptions were often those that seemed so obviously true that questioning them appeared foolish or perverse. The belief that political authority derived from divine appointment, that military victory depended primarily on courage and honor, or that economic prosperity resulted from accumulating precious metals all seemed self-evident to most people of his era. Yet each of these assumptions contained fatal flaws that led to disastrous consequences when applied uncritically to complex political situations. The process of intellectual liberation from these hidden tyrannies required what described as a return to first principles, a systematic examination of the foundations of knowledge and belief that most people took for granted. This was not merely an academic exercise, but a practical necessity for anyone who sought to navigate successfully the treacherous waters of political life. It demanded a willingness to question not only specific policies and strategies, but the entire conceptual framework within which political thinking took place. This intellectual revolution could not be accomplished through abstract reasoning alone, but required constant confrontation with empirical reality. Emphasized the importance of studying history not as a collection of moral exemplars or cautionary tales, but as a laboratory for testing political theories and assumptions. The past provided a vast repository of natural experiments that could reveal the actual consequences of different approaches to governance, warfare, and diplomacy, allowing careful observers to distinguish between beliefs that corresponded to reality and those that were merely wishful thinking or cultural prejudice. The implications of this analysis extended far beyond the immediate concerns of princes and republics to encompass the fundamental nature of human knowledge and judgment. Recognized that the tendency to hold unquestioned beliefs was not a failing unique to political leaders, but a universal human characteristic that affected all areas of life. Scientists, philosophers, merchants, and artisans were equally susceptible to the trap of assuming that their established methods and assumptions were necessarily correct simply because they had become familiar and comfortable. The antidote to this universal human weakness required the cultivation of what called not virtue in the conventional moral sense, but a combination of intellectual flexibility, practical wisdom, and psychological fortitude that enabled individuals to adapt effectively to changing circumstances. This quality could not be acquired through formal education alone, but required exposure to diverse experiences, systematic self-reflection, and the discipline to act on uncomfortable truths, even when doing so involved personal costs. The development of was particularly challenging, because it required individuals to maintain a delicate balance between confidence and humility, between decisiveness and flexibility, between commitment to principles and willingness to revise them when necessary. Those who swung too far toward skepticism and relativism became paralyzed by uncertainty and unable to act effectively, while those who remained too committed to established beliefs became rigid and unable to adapt to new situations. The institutional implications of this analysis were profound. Traditional forms of government, education, and social organization all tended to reinforce rather than challenge the tendency toward unquestioned beliefs. Religious institutions promoted faith over inquiry. Educational systems emphasized the transmission of established knowledge over critical examination, and political structures rewarded conformity over innovation. Any serious attempt to address the problem of unquestioned beliefs would require fundamental changes in these basic social arrangements. Envision the possibility of creating institutions that would systematically counteract the human tendency toward intellectual complacency. These would include formal mechanisms for challenging established assumptions, rewards for those who identified flaws in conventional thinking, and protections for individuals who questioned popular beliefs. Such institutions would be difficult to establish and maintain because they would threaten existing power structures and challenge the psychological comfort that most people derived from their unexamined beliefs. The personal cost of pursuing such intellectual honesty was considerable. Those who dedicated themselves to questioning fundamental assumptions inevitably found themselves isolated from mainstream society, viewed with suspicion by authorities, and burdened with the psychological weight of uncertainty. Himself experienced this isolation during his exile, as his commitment to honest analysis of political reality put him at odds with the comfortable illusions that most of his contemporaries preferred to maintain. Yet the alternative, remaining trapped within the confines of unquestioned beliefs, was far more dangerous in the long run. History was littered with the ruins of civilizations that had been destroyed not by external enemies, but by their own intellectual rigidity, their inability to adapt their fundamental assumptions to changing circumstances. The choice was ultimately between the temporary discomfort of questioning cherished beliefs and the catastrophic consequences of clinging to them when they no longer corresponded to reality. The process of liberation from unquestioned beliefs was not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing struggle that required constant vigilance and renewal. New assumptions inevitably arose to replace old ones, and these new beliefs were just as susceptible to hardening into unexamined doctrine as their predecessors had been. The key was to develop habits of mind that treated all beliefs as provisional and subject to revision, that welcomed challenges and contradictions as opportunities for learning rather than threats to be resisted. This intellectual discipline was particularly crucial for those in positions of authority, whose unquestioned beliefs had the potential to affect not only their own fate, but the welfare of entire populations. A prince whose false assumptions led to military defeat or economic collapse bore responsibility, not only for his own downfall, but for the suffering of his subjects. The moral dimension of intellectual honesty thus extended beyond personal virtue to encompass the ethical obligations that accompanied political power. The shadow of unexamined assumptions fell most heavily across the realm of statecraft, where the consequences of intellectual error exponentially through the mechanisms of power and authority. Careful observation of princely courts and republican councils revealed a disturbing pattern. The higher one rose in the hierarchy of command, the more insulated one became from corrective feedback, and thus the more dangerous became the persistence of false beliefs. In the court of Medici, which had observed with the analytical eye of a political anatomist, he witnessed daily the operation of what he came to understand as systematic self-deception. The prince, surrounded by advisors whose livelihood depended upon maintaining his favor, received information filtered through layers of interpretation, each layer shaped by the need to conform to existing expectations and prejudices. Reports from the countryside were edited to minimize bad news, military assessments were adjusted to support predetermined strategies, and economic analyses were crafted to justify policies that had already been decided upon for entirely different reasons. This institutional distortion of reality created what observed to be a peculiar form of collective madness, in which entire governments could operate for extended periods based on completely false assumptions about their circumstances. The papal court under Julius II provided a particularly striking example of this phenomenon. The Pope's unshakable belief in the effectiveness of spiritual authority in temporal matters led him to pursue military and diplomatic strategies that made sense only if one accepted the premise that other rulers would subordinate their practical interests to their religious obligations. When this assumption proved false, as it invariably did, the resulting setbacks were attributed to the moral failings of others rather than to the unrealistic nature of the underlying expectations. The mechanism by which false beliefs perpetuated themselves within political institutions proved to be remarkably sophisticated. Information that confirmed existing assumptions was amplified and celebrated, while contradictory evidence was minimized, reinterpreted, or simply ignored. Those who provided confirming information were rewarded with access and influence, while those who challenged fundamental premises found themselves marginalized and excluded from decision-making processes. Over time, this created a form of institutional natural selection, that favored the survival and reproduction of comfortable illusions over uncomfortable truths. Documented numerous instances in which this dynamic led to spectacular political failures. The Florentine Republic's persistent belief in the loyalty of their mercenary troops led them to underestimate the threat posed by more unified military forces, contributing to their eventual subjugation. The French court's assumption that Italian politics could be managed through traditional feudal relationships blinded them to the more complex web of interests and loyalties that actually governed the peninsula's affairs. In each case, the failure to question fundamental assumptions about the nature of political reality led to strategic miscalculations that might have been avoided through more rigorous intellectual discipline. The problem was compounded by the tendency of successful leaders to attribute their achievements to the wisdom of their fundamental beliefs rather than to favorable circumstances or good fortune. A prince who prospered during a period of economic growth might conclude that his governing philosophy was vindicated, even if his policies had actually hindered rather than helped the natural development of prosperity. This confusion of correlation with causation led to the entrenchment of ineffective practices and the persistence of counterproductive assumptions long after their original justification had disappeared. The most insidious form of this self-deception involved the creation of elaborate theoretical systems designed to rationalize and defend existing prejudices. Observed how political thinkers constructed complex arguments about natural law, divine right, and historical precedent that served primarily to justify the status rather than to illuminate the actual dynamics of political power. These theoretical edifices became increasingly divorced from empirical reality, creating a parallel intellectual universe in which consistency with abstract principles mattered more than effectiveness in achieving practical results. The danger of such systematized false belief was that it could persist even in the face of repeated failure, because each setback could be explained away as the result of inadequate implementation or external interference rather than fundamental conceptual error. The scholastic tradition that dominated medieval political thought provided numerous examples of this phenomenon, as elaborate theories of just war, legitimate authority, and natural hierarchy continued to flourish even as the political realities they purported to describe were transformed beyond recognition. This analysis revealed that the most effective political actors throughout history had been those who managed to escape this trap of theoretical abstraction and maintain direct contact with empirical reality. These individuals possessed what he described as the capacity for disillusionment, the ability to abandon cherished beliefs when evidence contradicted them, regardless of the psychological or social costs involved. This quality was exceedingly rare because it required not only intellectual honesty, but also a form of emotional resilience that allowed individuals to function effectively despite uncertainty and ambiguity. Caesar had demonstrated this capacity in his willingness to violate the constitutional traditions of the Roman Republic when those traditions became obstacles to effective governance. Rather than remaining trapped within the conceptual framework that had defined legitimate political action for centuries, he recognized that changed circumstances required new approaches and was prepared to accept the risks and consequences of innovation. His success stemmed not from superior adherence to established principles, but from superior adaptation to existing realities. Similarly, the Venetian Republic had institutionalized mechanisms for maintaining contact with empirical reality that protected them from the worst effects of collective self-deception. Their extensive intelligence networks, their systematic rotation of offices, and their elaborate procedures for debating policy alternatives all served to prevent the crystallization of unexamined assumptions that had proved so destructive to other political entities. Their success lay not in the superiority of their fundamental beliefs, but in their systematic skepticism toward all beliefs, including their own. The challenge of maintaining this intellectual discipline was complicated by the natural human tendency to seek certainty and closure. Political decision-making required confidence and decisiveness, qualities that seemed to conflict with the systematic doubt and self-questioning that intellectual honesty demanded. The most successful leaders somehow managed to combine operational confidence with philosophical humility, acting decisively on the basis of provisional judgments, while remaining open to evidence that might require fundamental revisions of their approach. This delicate balance could not be maintained through individual effort alone, but required institutional support and cultural reinforcement. Societies that valued intellectual courage over conformity, that rewarded innovation over tradition, and that protected dissent over orthodoxy were more likely to produce leaders capable of the intellectual flexibility that effective governance required. Conversely, societies that prized stability over adaptation, that punished questioning over compliance, and that valued harmony over truth inevitably produced leaders trapped within the confines of inherited assumptions. The implications of this analysis extended beyond the immediate concerns of political leadership to encompass the fundamental relationship between knowledge and power. Recognized that the concentration of authority inevitably created incentives for intellectual corruption, as those who possessed the ability to enforce their beliefs had little reason to subject those beliefs to rigorous scrutiny. This suggested that the preservation of intellectual integrity required not merely individual virtue, but structural safeguards against the abuse of epistemic authority. The most dangerous form of this abuse occurred when political power was used to suppress alternative perspectives and enforce conformity with official doctrine. Observed how religious and secular authorities collaborated in creating ideological monopolies that prevented the emergence of competing interpretations of reality. These monopolies were maintained not through rational argumentation, but through control of education, manipulation of information, and punishment of dissent. The result was the creation of entire societies trapped within collective delusions that bore little relationship to actual conditions. Historical record provided numerous examples of civilizations that had been destroyed by their own intellectual rigidity. The Byzantine Empire's commitment to theological abstractions had prevented them from adapting to the military and economic challenges posed by more pragmatic competitors. The later Roman Empire's adherence to traditional administrative and military practices had left them vulnerable to barbarian forces that operated according to entirely different principles. In each case, the failure to question fundamental assumptions had proved more catastrophic than any external threat. The process of intellectual liberation from these inherited delusions required what described as a return to the beginning, a systematic examination of first principles that most people accepted without question. This involved not merely the rejection of obviously false beliefs, but the careful analysis of assumptions that seemed so natural and obvious that they had never been subjected to critical examination. The most dangerous errors were often embedded in the very language and conceptual frameworks that people used to think about political problems. This intellectual archaeology was necessarily a collective enterprise that required the contributions of multiple perspectives and the gradual accumulation of empirical evidence over extended periods. No individual, however brilliant or well-intentioned, could single-handedly overcome the vast accumulation of inherited assumptions that shaped political understanding. The task required institutions capable of preserving and transmitting skeptical attitudes across generations, protecting minority viewpoints from suppression, and maintaining space for intellectual experimentation and innovation. The creation of such institutions faced enormous obstacles because they threatened existing power structures and challenged the psychological comfort that most people derived from their unexamined beliefs. Those who benefited from current arrangements had strong incentives to prevent the emergence of alternative perspectives that might undermine their position. Those who found security in traditional beliefs were likely to resist innovations that introduced uncertainty and ambiguity into their understanding of the world. Yet the alternative, remaining trapped within the confines of inherited assumptions, was ultimately self-defeating. History demonstrated repeatedly that societies unable to adapt their fundamental beliefs to changing circumstances eventually faced catastrophic collapse. The choice was not between comfort and discomfort, but between temporary discomfort and ultimate destruction. Those who chose the path of intellectual courage might face immediate costs and uncertainties, but they preserved the possibility of long-term survival and prosperity. The personal dimension of this struggle involved what recognized as a fundamental transformation of character and identity. Breaking free from unquestioned beliefs required individuals to surrender the psychological security that came from feeling that they understood their world and possessed reliable guides for action. This surrender was particularly difficult for those who had built their public reputation and private self-concept around the possession of wisdom and certainty. The process of intellectual liberation thus involved not merely the acquisition of new knowledge, but the cultivation of new virtues: humility in the face of complexity, courage in the face of uncertainty, and persistence in the face of opposition. These virtues could not be taught through abstract instruction, but had to be developed through practical experience, through confrontation with the consequences of false beliefs, and through the gradual accumulation of evidence that comfortable assumptions were indeed false. The reward for this difficult transformation was not the achievement of final truth or ultimate certainty, but the development of intellectual capabilities that allowed for more effective adaptation to changing circumstances. Those who freed themselves from the tyranny of unquestioned beliefs did not necessarily become wiser in any absolute sense, but they became more capable of learning from experience, more responsive to feedback, and more able to recognize and correct their own errors before those errors led to catastrophic consequences. The third and perhaps most profound dimension of the danger posed by unquestioned beliefs revealed itself in their capacity to shape not merely individual judgment and institutional behavior, but the very foundation of development. His extended meditation on this theme led him to recognize that the rise and fall of entire cultures could be traced to their relationship with fundamental, unexamined assumptions about the nature of reality, human nature, and the proper ordering of society. From his vantage point in early 16th century Italy, surrounded by the ruins of classical antiquity and witnessing the birth pangs of a new European order, perceived that the most decisive battles in human history were fought not on physical battlefields, but in the realm of ideas and beliefs. The civilizations that thrived were those that somehow managed to maintain intellectual flexibility and adaptability, while those that declined and fell were invariably trapped by rigid adherence to assumptions that had outlived their usefulness. The Roman Empire provided the most instructive case study for this analysis. Spent countless hours analyzing the mechanisms by which a civilization that had demonstrated remarkable adaptability and pragmatism in its rise eventually succumbed to intellectual ossification in its decline. The early Romans had been notably flexible in their approach to governance, religion, and military organization, borrowing freely from other cultures and adapting their institutions to meet new challenges. Their success stemmed not from the superiority of any particular set of beliefs, but from their willingness to abandon beliefs that proved ineffective and adopt new approaches that delivered better results. The transformation of Rome from republic to empire illustrated this principle in dramatic fashion. The republican institutions that had served effectively in governing a city-state and its immediate environs proved inadequate to the challenges of managing a vast Mediterranean empire. Rather than clinging to traditional forms out of misplaced reverence for the past, successful Roman leaders like Caesar and Augustus recognized the need for fundamental institutional innovation and were prepared to abandon constitutional principles that had become obstacles to effective governance. The later decline of Rome, however, demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of intellectual rigidity. As the empire matured, its institutions became increasingly bureaucratized, and its governing class increasingly committed to preserving existing arrangements regardless of their effectiveness. The assumption that traditional Roman methods were inherently superior to foreign alternatives led to a systematic neglect of military, administrative, and economic innovations that might have enabled the empire to respond more effectively to new challenges. The rise of Christianity within the Roman world provided another illustration of how unquestioned beliefs could reshape the trajectory of an entire civilization. The early Christian movement had demonstrated remarkable intellectual flexibility, adapting its message and organizational structure to appeal to diverse populations and incorporating elements from various philosophical and religious traditions. This adaptability enabled it to spread rapidly throughout the empire and eventually to achieve a position of dominance. However, the institutionalization of Christianity led to the crystallization of certain assumptions about the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority, the nature of legitimate knowledge, and the proper ordering of human society. These assumptions, which had served effectively during the period of Christian expansion, became increasingly problematic as circumstances changed and new challenges emerged. The insistence that all valid knowledge must conform to established theological doctrine stifled intellectual innovation and prevented the development of new approaches to natural philosophy, political organization, and economic development. Observed that this pattern of initial flexibility followed by eventual rigidity was not unique to Rome or Christianity, but represented a general tendency in human social organization. Successful civilizations typically began with a period of intellectual openness and experimental adaptation that enabled them to develop effective solutions to pressing challenges. Over time, however, these solutions hardened into orthodoxies that were valued not for their continuing effectiveness, but for their historical association with past success. The Islamic world provided another compelling example of this dynamic. During its initial centuries of expansion, Islamic civilization had demonstrated remarkable intellectual curiosity and adaptability, incorporating mathematical, philosophical, and scientific knowledge from Greek, Persian, Indian, and other sources while developing innovative approaches to law, administration, and urban organization. The assumption that truth could be found through rational inquiry and empirical observation, combined with respect for useful knowledge regardless of its source, had enabled Islamic societies to achieve extraordinary levels of prosperity and cultural achievement. The gradual triumph of more rigid theological and legal orthodoxies within Islamic civilization, however, had led to a systematic suppression of intellectual innovation and a growing resistance to ideas that challenged established authorities. The assumption that all necessary knowledge had already been revealed and led to a decline in scientific research, philosophical inquiry, and technological development that left Islamic societies increasingly vulnerable to competition from cultures that maintained greater intellectual flexibility. The emerging European civilization of time was itself struggling with this fundamental tension between tradition and innovation, between reverence for established authorities and openness to new possibilities. The humanist movement that had shaped its own intellectual development represented an attempt to recover the intellectual flexibility of classical antiquity while avoiding the rigidity that had characterized medieval thought. Yet even this movement was susceptible to its own forms of orthodoxy, its own unquestioned assumptions about the superiority of ancient wisdom and the value of textual authority. The discovery of the Americas and the expansion of European contact with other civilizations was forcing a fundamental reconsideration of basic assumptions about geography, human nature, and social organization. The existence of entire populations that had developed sophisticated societies without knowledge of Christianity or classical philosophy challenged fundamental European beliefs about the universality of their own cultural achievements. The wealth and power that flowed from these new discoveries was reshaping the balance of power within Europe itself, rendering obsolete many traditional assumptions about the sources of political and economic strength. Recognized that this period of intellectual upheaval presented both enormous opportunities and terrible dangers. Societies that managed to adapt their fundamental assumptions to new realities would be positioned to take advantage of unprecedented possibilities for expansion and development. Those that remained trapped within inherited belief systems would find themselves increasingly marginalized and vulnerable to more adaptive competitors. The challenge was complicated by the fact that the process of questioning fundamental assumptions inevitably created social and political instability. Beliefs about the divine right of kings, the natural hierarchy of social classes, and the proper relationship between church and state were not merely abstract philosophical positions, but the foundation of existing power structures. Challenging these beliefs threatened to undermine the entire social order, creating the possibility of chaos and conflict that might prove more destructive than the gradual decline that would result from maintaining ineffective but stable institutions. This dilemma was particularly acute for political leaders who bore responsibility for maintaining order and security, while simultaneously recognizing the need for fundamental change. The prince who moved too quickly to abandon traditional assumptions risked provoking rebellion and disorder among subjects who were not prepared for such radical transformations. The prince who moved too slowly risked being overwhelmed by competitors who had adapted more effectively to new circumstances. The solution to this dilemma required what described as the art of timing the ability to gauge when circumstances had changed sufficiently to make traditional assumptions untenable, and when popular opinion had evolved enough to accept necessary innovations. This art could not be learned through abstract study, but required intimate knowledge of particular circumstances, deep understanding of human psychology, and the kind of practical wisdom that came only through extensive experience with the unpredictable dynamics of political life. The institutional dimension of this challenge involved creating mechanisms that could facilitate the gradual evolution of fundamental assumptions without precipitating social collapse. Traditional institutions like monarchy and aristocracy had developed elaborate procedures for preserving stability and continuity, but these same procedures often made them resistant to necessary adaptations. Republican institutions had greater capacity for innovation and change, but they were also more vulnerable to factional conflict and popular delusion. The most successful political entities seemed to be those that combined elements of both stability and flexibility, creating institutions that could preserve core functions while adapting peripheral arrangements to meet new challenges. The Venetian Republic, which studied extensively, had developed elaborate constitutional mechanisms that allowed for policy innovation while maintaining fundamental continuity in their basic approach to governance. Their success stemmed not from the brilliance of any particular institutional arrangement, but from their systematic attention to the problem of balancing stability with adaptability. The cultural dimension of this challenge involved cultivating attitudes and values that would support the kind of intellectual flexibility that survival required. This meant developing educational systems that emphasized critical thinking over rote memorization, encouraging intellectual curiosity over doctrinal conformity, and rewarding innovation over traditionalism. It also meant creating social norms that tolerated disagreement and dissent, that valued truth over harmony, and that celebrated intellectual courage over conventional wisdom. The difficulty of this cultural transformation was that it required people to abandon many of the psychological comforts that traditional belief systems provided. The certainty that came from believing in absolute truths, the security that derived from feeling that one understood the fundamental nature of reality, and the sense of identity that came from belonging to a community united by shared convictions, all had to be sacrificed in favor of more provisional and uncertain forms of understanding. Yet the historical record suggested that civilizations capable of making this transformation were rewarded with extraordinary achievements in knowledge, prosperity, and power. The classical Greeks had demonstrated that societies organized around intellectual inquiry and rational debate could achieve remarkable innovations in philosophy, science, and political organization. The early Islamic civilization had shown that cultures committed to learning and adaptation could rapidly assimilate and improve upon the achievements of their predecessors while developing entirely new approaches to human problems. The contemporary European experience was providing another demonstration of the transformative potential of intellectual flexibility. The willingness of European scholars to challenge medieval authorities and return to classical sources had already generated remarkable innovations in art, literature, and natural philosophy. The European expansion into previously unknown regions of the world was producing an unprecedented accumulation of new knowledge about geography, biology, and human social organization. The development of new technologies like printing was making possible entirely new forms of communication and education. Understood that the ultimate test of European civilization would be its ability to absorb and integrate these revolutionary developments without losing the social cohesion and political effectiveness that had enabled its initial success. This would require a fundamental transformation in the relationship between authority and knowledge, between tradition and innovation, and between individual judgment and collective wisdom. The personal implications of this transformation were profound. Individuals living through such periods of intellectual upheaval faced unprecedented challenges in constructing coherent identities and meaningful lives. The traditional sources of guidance, religious authority, family tradition, and community custom were all being called into question, leaving people to navigate complex moral and practical decisions without reliable external guidance. This situation created both extraordinary opportunities for human development and terrible risks of confusion and despair. Those who managed to develop the intellectual and emotional capabilities necessary for independent judgment could achieve levels of knowledge, creativity, and personal fulfillment that had been unimaginable in more traditional societies. Those who found themselves overwhelmed by uncertainty and ambiguity might retreat into various forms of fundamentalism or nihilism that offered the illusion of certainty at the cost of connection with reality. The cultivation of what termed philosophical virtue thus became not merely a matter of personal development, but a requirement for survival. This virtue combined intellectual honesty with emotional resilience, systematic doubt with practical effectiveness, and individual autonomy with social responsibility. It could not be achieved through formal education alone, but required the kind of practical experience with uncertainty and change that forced individuals to develop their own capacities for judgment and adaptation. The ultimate goal of this transformation was not the achievement of final truth or perfect wisdom, but the development of intellectual capabilities that would enable humanity to continue learning and adapting as circumstances changed and new challenges emerged. The civilizations that mastered this art of perpetual intellectual renewal would be positioned to take advantage of whatever opportunities the future might offer, while those that remained trapped within rigid belief systems would inevitably face decline and eventual extinction. As concluded his extended meditation on these themes in the quiet of his study, watching the sun set over the hills of Tuscany and reflecting on the turbulent events of his lifetime, he understood that he had identified one of the fundamental challenges of human existence. The capacity to question fundamental assumptions was both the source of humanity's greatest achievements and the requirement for its continued survival. The individuals and societies that developed this capacity would inherit the future, while those that failed to do so would be consigned to the dustbin of history, their unquestioned beliefs serving as monuments to the dangers of intellectual complacency in a world of perpetual change.